The lamp flickers. The light cuts out of the darkness only a piece of the street and a shadow. Underfoot, not cobblestones, but movement, a squeak that doesn't stop even at night. In Victorian London, there were jobs that weren't written about in the newspapers, jobs that weren't shown to children. He went where even the police were afraid to go down, into the basements, into the sewers, into places where the city was rotting from within. They called him simply the ratcatcher. For a few coins, he risked his life, his health, and his mind. Diseases, bites, darkness, and silence, broken only by the rustle of hundreds of paws. Today we will go down with him, slowly, without haste, to where this job was necessary and cursed. This is a story about work that no one wanted, and about people that history chose to ignore. London did not sleep. It only changed its face. When the last shops closed their doors, when the gas lamps remained the only islands of light, the city threw off the mask of day and showed what it had always hidden. London at night was not dark. It was thick. The air grew heavier, as if absorbing every day, every step, every cigarette butt, every whisper and every cry that remained between the stones. It smelled of coal, dampness, horse sweat, and something else, deeper, older, rotten, a smell that did not disappear even in winter. Rats knew this smell better than people, for it was the smell of a city that feeds. They did not appear suddenly. They were always there. They were not seen during the day, but that didn't mean they weren't there. Beneath every floorboard, under every step, under every house that seemed solid and reliable, there was life. Not human. In some areas, Whitechapel, Southwark, Limehouse, the floor sometimes moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, and those who had lived there long had learned not to pay attention, because if you started looking down, sooner or later you had to go down. At night, the city spoke a different language, not with bells, not with footsteps, but with rustling. You could hear it when you lay awake, like something scratching inside the wall, like someone running right under your bed, like the building itself had a life of its own. Some said it was water. Some said it was pipes. But everyone knew the truth. Rats weren't afraid of people. People were afraid of rats. Because a rat is not just an animal. It's a sign of dirt, a sign of hunger, a sign that the city was losing a war that it had never officially declared. The Victorian era loved order. Tables, reports, lists. But you couldn't count the rats. Every one killed meant that 10 more were being born somewhere nearby. Sometimes in the morning, you would find something that you didn't want to find. A baby's gnawed fingers, traces of blood on the edge of the bed, silence where there had been crying yesterday. They didn't write about it in the newspapers. It spoiled the image of the empire. This is where he comes in. Not a hero, not a defender, a worker, a rat hunter. He was not welcomed. He was not shaken by the hand. He was shown down, into the basement, into the hatch, into the darkness. He went down where even the owners of the houses did not want to look, where there were no stones underfoot, only slime, bones, and movement. It was a job that was not passed down, because the father did not want this for his son. But sometimes there was no choice. Rat hunters rarely lived to old age, not because they were killed immediately, but because each descent took something. Strength, breath, peace. The bite did not always hurt immediately. The infection came later. Several days of fever, delusions, and silence. And the city quickly found another. And this is only the surface, because to understand this work, you need to go even deeper, to where the light of the lantern ceases to be useful. The city that moved at night. The descent always began the same way. The hatch, the stairs, the smell. Patsirolov knew this smell even before he saw the darkness. He climbed towards it, heavy, warm, sweet. The smell of dampness, rotting wood, old grease, human waste, and something alive that never stops. When the hatch closed from above, the city disappeared. There were no more facades. There were no shop windows. There weren't even streets. Only the space beneath the city remained. Time wasn't counted here, because there was no day here. The light from the lantern didn't dispel the darkness. It only cut a piece out of it. And each piece seemed wrong. The walls were slippery. The floor was soft, as if it were breathing. A step and the boot would stick. The rats did not run away immediately. They waited. And that was the worst. The first time a person descended, he was still listening. He listened. He tried to distinguish sounds. But very quickly the rat hunter understood. Hearing is no help here, because the rats did not make noise chaotically. They moved rhythmically. It was like breathing, like a pulse. The city under the city lived by its own rules, and the most dangerous thing here was not what you see, but what you do not see, but feel. Movement under your feet, a light touch on your ankle, wool sliding over your skin, and then the understanding came. You are a guest here. Ratcatchers rarely worked alone, but even in pairs, the real work was lonely. For in the dark, each was left alone with his own fear. One walked ahead, the other held the lantern. Sometimes they would switch. A dog or a ferret would run first, and if an animal suddenly froze, that meant danger. The rats didn't always attack. They waited, especially where it was warm, especially near the places where people slept upstairs, under beds, under kitchens, under hospitals. Yes, even under hospitals. In Victorian London, under hospitals was the worst. All the roads converged there. Blood, bandages, food, waste. And the rats knew it. The rat hunter, who worked under the hospital, didn't ask what was up there. He didn't want to know, because where people were treated, underground medicine was different. Bite, infection, death without a diagnosis. Some said that rats could sense illness, and that they went where the body was already weak. Whether it was true or not, nobody checked, because those who checked often didn't return. Sometimes the rat hunter found nests. It didn't look like a bird's nest. It was a collection. Rags, bones, gnawed remains of food, and movement. Hundreds of bodies, thousands of paws. The flashlight illuminated them, and they looked back. They didn't run away. They watched, eyes shining, alive, intelligent. At such moments, many lost control, screamed, ran, fell. And then the city took its own. The rat catcher who survived learned to stand still, breathe slowly, don't make sudden movements, because panic here meant the end. Not all rat catchers were the same. Some worked quickly, roughly, with poison. Others worked slowly, with traps, with animals. There were also those who caught rats alive. They were bought for fights, for entertainment, for experiments. London had an appetite not only for meat, but also for cruelty. And the rat-catcher stood in the middle of this chain. He was not the lowest, but I wasn't free. After the first hour underground, the body would start to protest. My head would get dizzy, the air would get heavier, the lantern would dim, and then a thought would come that would break many. What if I don't get out? Not because of the rats, not because of the bite, but simply because I won't find my way back. The drains would get confused, the passages would cross, the marks would disappear. There were stories about rat-catchers who would wander underground for days. They would eat what they found. They would drink water from the walls. And when they were found, they wouldn't talk anymore. The exit always seemed unreal. When the hatch opened, the light from above would hit the eyes, like an exposure. People would turn away. The children watched with interest. Patsiorolov came out different than he had come in. Dirtier, quieter, sometimes with blood on his hands. He was paid, quickly, without gratitude, because people wanted to forget what had just been under their feet, and the city continued to live. Until the next night, until the next challenge, until the next descent. And Patsiorolov knew this was only the beginning, because the true price of this work was not immediately apparent. It came later, in dreams, in the body, in the fear of the dark. Rat-catchers were not born. They were made. Not by calling, not by talent, but by circumstances that tightened like a noose. Most of them came from the same neighborhoods where rats had been neighbors since childhood. They grew up hearing the squeaking in the walls, saw how the mother lifted her skirt to check for bite marks on the baby's legs, and knew that this was normal. In Victorian London, poverty was no exception. It was a system. Jobs disappeared faster than they appeared. Factories closed. Dockers waited for days. Former soldiers returned without pensions and without a place. And when the choice was between starvation and work that others turned away from, the choice was made by itself. Everyone remembered the first descent, even those who later said that it was habit. Nobody really got used to it. The first time, the lantern seemed too weak. The smell was too strong. The movement was too close. The first time, the hands trembled so much that the traps fell to the floor. The dog whined. The ferret hid behind its leg. And someone always vomited. It wasn't weakness. It was the body that understood that it was being taken where a person shouldn't be. The older rat hunters didn't reassure them. They didn't say, "You'll get used to it." They said something different. Look under your feet. Don't breathe through your mouth. Don't run. If you fall, get up slowly. If you get bitten, don't show fear. It was the language of survival. And the newcomers listened, because mistakes were not forgiven here. Some brought their sons with them, not because they wanted to, but because there was nowhere to put them. The boys held the lantern. They carried the sacks. They learned to be silent. They knew the darkness before the alphabet. They knew what fear sounds like when it tries not to go outside. They didn't talk about it out loud, because it was too ugly even for a city that had seen a lot. But the children were part of this work, and the city accepted it. The rat hunter had no days off. The rats didn't know the calendar. They could bring the summons at night. They could knock on the door. They could just wait by the house. There's traffic again. There's children crying again. There's someone missing again. They paid in different ways, sometimes with money, sometimes with food, sometimes nothing, just a promise. And the rat catcher went, because refusal meant that they wouldn't call next time, and not calling meant hunger. Over time, the body changed. The cough became constant. The skin grew coarser. The eyes got used to the semi-darkness. But sleep? No. Sleep was broken. Dreams came in fragments. Rats ran across the ceiling. The lantern went out. The hatches closed. Many began to drink, not for fun, for silence in the head. And the city watched silently again. The worst thing was not what the eyes saw, but what remained. After work, the hands trembled for a long time. The food tasted different. The silence in the room seemed suspicious. And then came the realization: rats are not the main enemy. The main enemy is what this work does to a person. It erased the line between normal and bottom, between life above and life below, and some could no longer return completely. Ballads were not written about rat catchers. They did not erect monuments. They were not remembered on holidays. They were shadows that moved along with the city, and when one disappeared, another took his place. The city did not stop. Basements, drains, and forbidden places. If London was a city by day, then at night it was a cover. Real life, the thing that sustained, fed, and slowly killed its inhabitants, happened below. Under every house there was a basement. Under every basement, another space. And beneath them were drains, passages, cavities, cracks that no one had designed but everyone had used. It wasn't a system. It was a collection of mistakes superimposed on each other over the centuries. Old Roman canals, medieval drains, makeshift passages, breached walls, forgotten rooms, and it all connected. The map of London's underground existed only in the minds of those who went down there regularly. And even they didn't know it completely, because every rain changed the landscape. Each collapse blocked the path. Each new building created a shadow where there was none before. The rat hunter did not trust maps. He trusted the body's memory. Here, slippery. Here, low. Here, always moving. Here, do not go in alone. This is how knowledge was transmitted, not in words, but through fear. The basements were the first frontier, formally part of the house. In fact, a separate world. Coal was stored there, food, old furniture, animal bodies, and that was where the rats came first. They did not hide in the basements. They lived openly. Nests under the stairs, in piles of rags, behind barrels. Sometimes the rat hunter would go down and see that the basement no longer belonged to people. Teeth marks on the walls, gnawed beams, a smell that cut the throat. And then it was clear, if they didn't stop it here, they would go further. But the basements were just the beginning. The real work began below. The drains. Narrow, low, filled with water and what the water took with it. There were no flat surfaces here. It wasn't dry here. Everything flowed here. The rat hunter walked hunched over, sometimes on his knees, sometimes crawling. The lantern hung low, and the light reflected off the water, creating the illusion of movement where there wasn't any. But he always appeared. In the drains, the rats were different, bigger, more aggressive, less cautious. They didn't run away right away. they checked. One would come closer. The other would run around. The third would disappear into the darkness. Sometimes it seemed that they were working together. The rat-catchers didn't say this out loud, but they thought it. Because when you see how the rats bypass the traps, you start to doubt your own superiority. There were places where you didn't go down unnecessarily, prohibited not by law, but by common sense. Old branches, flooded passages, tunnels with no exit. There were no customers there. There was no payment there. But sometimes the rats came from there. And then there was no choice. In such places, there was no sound of the city, no footsteps, no wheels, no voices, only water, drops, and movement. A person in such a space felt superfluous. The ceiling pressed down. The air did not move. The lantern only gave the illusion of control. And then the rat hunter understood. If something went wrong, no one would know right away. Maybe never. There were stories about hatches that closed, about stairs that broke, about people who disappeared between the call and dawn. Bodies were not always found. Sometimes only a lantern was found, or a bag, or nothing. And the city continued to stand above. In the dungeons of London, there was another rule. Never go down where it was too quiet. Silence meant that something was wrong, or the rats had disappeared, or they wait. And the rat hunter was always afraid of the other. No rat hunter called a dungeon a labyrinth out loud. The word sounded too soft. A labyrinth is something created with intention, with a plan, with a way out. What was under London was an accumulation of accidents. Walls were built and demolished. Tunnels were dug and forgotten. Holes were made and not marked. Each generation built on top of the other without looking down, and there it all remained. The first mistake of a novice was the desire to memorize the route. The second was the belief that this route would remain unchanged. After rain, the dungeon changed. After frost, after building from above, it was a must. The rat hunter walked and suddenly found himself in front of a wall, which was not there yesterday, or before a failure which did not exist yesterday. In such places, the lantern was held closer, not for light, for peace. The real labyrinth began where the signs of human presence disappeared. There were no boards, no bricks with stamps, no traces of repair, only stone, water, and something that moved between them. These areas were called differently: blind passages, dead loops, rotten knees. The names were crude but accurate, because that was where people disappeared. In such places, they did not set traps. There was no point there. A trap is a sign that you plan to return. Here, too, the rat-catcher moved cautiously, checking every step, because the trap could not be only for a rat. Slippery stone, an unexpected hole, a collapse. The fall into the dungeon was rarely rapid, more often slow, with a scream which was immediately extinguished by water and stone. There were places where the lantern began to behave strangely. The flame trembled without a draft. The light dimmed suddenly. The air became thicker. There could be gases there, or it could be just stagnant air. Rat catchers feared this more than rats, because the gas didn't bite. It took them away silently. A few breaths, dizziness, and darkness already inside. Therefore, in such places, they moved faster. And it was dangerous. There were traps left by the city itself, old hatches without stairs, holes masked by water, holes below eye level. The rat hunter walked, looking ahead, and suddenly disappeared. The body was not always found. Sometimes only a boot was found, or a lantern, and the city was silent. The worst were the loops of no return, the passages that twisted, led down but back not. It was warmer there, wetter, livelier. Rats loved these places because people didn't come there often. And when the rat hunter realized that he had gone too far, panic came slowly. Not immediately. First, irritation. Then, doubt. Then, fear. And fear in the dungeon always came with a delay. Experienced rat hunters left marks, scratches, rags, drops of wax, but the marks disappeared. Water washed them away. Rats gnawed. Time erased them. And then you had to trust your memory. And your memory underground started to betray you. The same turns, the same walls, the same sounds. A person could walk around and not understand it. There were stories about rat hunters who heard voices. Not rat voices, human voices. Someone called. Someone whispered. Someone seemed to be standing behind them. Most understood it was fatigue. It was lack of air. It was fear. But not everyone could ignore it. Sometimes someone followed the voice and never came back. The scariest thing was to understand that you were alone. The lantern was dimming. The traps were empty. The dog was gone. And all around was movement. Not an attack. Not an escape. Observation. At such moments, the rat hunter stopped. Because movement meant death. To stand, breathe, wait, and hope that the city would let him go. There were those who returned from where they shouldn't have been. They didn't speak, or they spoke little. Their eyes looked through people, as if they were walls. Each challenge had its own rhythm. Not a schedule, not a plan. Rhythm. It began even before the descent, from the tone of voice of the one who came. When people spoke quickly, it meant fear. When in a whisper, shame. When dry and short, panic that they were trying to hide. There was movement again. There was gnawing again. There was no sleep. Patsurolov listened, but did not ask questions. Because questions did not change the route. The preparation was silent. The lantern was checked twice. The wick was trimmed. The wax was hidden in the pocket. The traps were checked by touch. The dog was kept closer. This was not caution. This was a ritual. Rituals calm down when everything else is out of control. The descent was slow. No one jumped into the trap door. No one was in a hurry. Because the first few minutes underground decided a lot. The eyes got used to the light, the lungs to the air, the body to the idea that the way back might be longer than it seems. And only then would the work begin. The route was never straight. The rat hunter moved as if he were reading space. He looked at the walls, at the footprints, at the movement of the water. The rats left marks, scratches, teeth marks, thin trails in the dirt. An experienced rat hunter saw them as clearly as a person from above sees tracks in the snow. And he went where these marks converged. The traps were not set where they saw the rats, but where they returned, near narrow passages, near warm places, near water. It required patience, and patience was the hardest part, because waiting in the dark is worse than moving. When you move, you feel like you are in control. When you wait, the the city is watching you. Night descents were the worst, not because of the darkness. There was always darkness, but because of fatigue. The rat hunter was walking after a day without food, after several challenges, after sleep which was in fragments. The body wanted to stop, but the work did not. And it was at such moments that mistakes happened. A step in the wrong direction. The movement was too fast, an unnecessary sound, and the rats felt it. There was a moment that rat trappers called the limit. It couldn't be explained in words. You could still walk. You could still hold the lantern. You could still think. But something inside said, no more. Someone listened. Someone didn't. Those who didn't listen often didn't return. Or they did return, but not the same. When the trap started working, the sound was clear. Metal. Movement. A squeak. This squeak was special. Not long, not loud. Sharp. And the rat trapper went towards it, as if on a signal. The trap had to be removed quickly, decisively, without hesitation. Because a wounded rat was not weak. He was dangerous. Sometimes the traps remained empty, and that was worse, because it meant that the rats were learning, that they were getting around, avoiding, waiting. On nights like these, the rat hunter knew, today the city was stronger. And then the task was not to win, but to get out. Getting out was never a joy, only a relief. When the hatch opened, the air above seemed cold and harsh. The light was too bright. The sounds were unnecessary. People were waiting for the result. How much? Is it safe? Will they come back? The rat hunter answered briefly, because explanations were not included in the payment. After work, they washed their hands for a long time, but the smell remained. It ate into their skin, into their clothes, into their dreams. And then silence came. Not peace, silence. The same one that was feared underground. Potsyrolov knew. The next challenge was a matter of time. The city was not healing. It was only postponing the problem. And under each house, darkness waited, who became a rat catcher. The city did not choose rat catchers at random. It filtered them out. Like water passing through the soil, London let thousands of people through and left those below who did not have the strength to stay above. A rat catcher was almost never new to the city. He knew it from the inside, from the bread lines, from the overnight stays, from the yards where children learned to be silent before they spoke. These were people who had already lost something important: a job, a family, health, sometimes a name. Many came from the docks, former porters, people with arms damaged by ropes and the cold, with backs that could no longer bear the weight. When the body refused to work on the surface, the city pushed it down. There is no need to carry it. There is a need to climb. And they climbed. Others came from the factories, those who were replaced by machines, those who were thrown out without explanation, those who stood at the machine yesterday and today stood with nothing. The factory noise changed to an underground silence, but the fear was the same. There were also former soldiers. They returned from wars without pensions, without support, without sleep. The darkness was not new to them. The smell of rot was also new, and the city took advantage of this. Potsyrolov, with his soldiers past, panicked less often. He ran away less often. But more often he broke down from within, because war had an enemy, and here the enemy was everywhere. Women were also part of this story, less often as those who went down, more often as those who stayed. They washed clothes that could not be washed. They bandaged bites. They cared for the sick. Sometimes it was the women who negotiated with the homeowners. They bargained, they begged, because the rat hunter could not always speak, and did not always want to. The children knew this profession from childhood, not from books, from life. They saw their father leave at night, and how the silent one returned. They knew that a lantern is not light, but a chance. Sometimes the children became part of the work, not officially, not written down, but constantly, holding the bag, handing the trap, standing by the hatch. The city closed its eyes. No one dreamed of becoming a rat catcher. It was not an ambition. It was a decision without an alternative. A person did not say, "I want." They said, "I must." And this must was harder than fear. There were those who came alone. They heard that they would pay. They heard that there was always work. They lasted a few weeks and disappeared. Or they left. Or they stayed underground. Those who survived longer had one thing in common. They knew how not to overthink, not to imagine, not to look ahead, to live from one descent to the next. Sometimes a rat catcher had a name, sometimes a nickname. The one without an eye, Old Tom, Horse. Names were erased faster than bodies, because the city remembered the function, not the person. Patsyurolov stood on a strange border. He was lower than everyone, but at the same time, necessary. He was avoided, but he was called. He was not shaken by the hand, but he was paid. And he knew, if he disappeared, the city would find another. The first descent never felt like work. It felt like a mistake that could still be fixed. The hatch seemed too dark. The stairs were too slippery. The smell was too strong to be real. And the thought would come to mind, I can go. Most people remembered this thought, and almost no one used it, because there was someone standing next to you who was already going down. And he looked at you as if he knew that you would go anyway. One of them was a former longshoreman. He didn't say his name. He just said that his hands no longer held the boxes. On the first day, he laughed. Loudly. Too loudly. The laughter sounded wrong in the basement. It bounced off the walls and returned like a stranger. When the hatch closed, the laughter disappeared. Only the breath remained. The other was a factory boy. He was not very old, but he already knew what it meant to be superfluous. He held the lantern carefully, as if afraid that it would be offended and go out. When something touched his leg, he did not scream. He froze. And that was what saved him that time. There was also a soldier. He walked confidently, too confidently. He said he had seen worse. He said the darkness was not the enemy. But when the rats did not run away, but simply stared, his steps slowed. Because war had a front, and here there was no front. The first bite was often not felt. The teeth went in quickly, like a needle. The pain came later. And that's why many didn't immediately understand what had happened. The hand would start to throb. The skin would turn red. Thoughts would become confused. The experienced ones would say, "Show me right away." But the beginners were shy, because a bite meant weakness, and weakness meant the end. After the first descent, most couldn't sleep. A person would lie down and hear movement. even where there wasn't any. Under the bed, in the walls, in their own heads. Some would get up and check the floor. Some would drink. Some would sit in the dark, waiting for dawn. And everyone knew, next time will be easier. It was a lie that the city repeated over and over again. The second descent was worse, because the illusion of novelty was disappearing. The person knew what awaited them, and they went anyway. It was here that the moment came when it was too late to retreat. Not physically, psychologically. Because if you return a second time, you are already a part of this world. Some broke down quickly. They disappeared without explanation. They moved. They hid. Sometimes they simply didn't come. They weren't asked about them, because everyone knew that they could have been in their place. Others stayed, not because they were stronger, but because they got used to it. Habituation was the most dangerous, because it erased the line between fear and the norm. The person stopped reacting. They stopped being afraid, and that's when the worst mistakes happened. There were several stories told in whispers about a man who went down alone, about a boy who didn't return but his lantern was found turned on, about a soldier who started talking to himself underground. These stories had no end, because the end was always the same. A ratcatcher didn't become a ratcatcher overnight. It was a slow transformation, step by step, descent by descent. And when a person realized that he was no longer afraid of the dark, he realized something else. He began to fear the surface. The worst didn't happen right away. Not on the first day. Not on the first bite. Not even on the first missing partner. The worst came quietly, when a person began to think that they had endured. The body changed slowly, so slowly that they didn't notice it. The cough became constant. The skin became rougher. The hands became rougher, as if they no longer belonged to a person, but to a tool. The eyes got used to the semi-darkness. The light from above was cutting. The sun was irritating. And the rat hunter began to avoid the day. The first to notice it were those who lived nearby. His wives, his children, his neighbors. He spoke less. He sat apart. He ate quickly, and always looked down, as if the floor could move. Some said that rat hunters smelled differently, not of dirt, not of sweat, but of a dungeon. This smell did not wash away. It ate into him. The psyche did not break loudly, without screams, without scenes. It simply contracted. A person stopped reacting to trifles, to pain, to cold. But any unexpected silence could throw him off balance. A rat hunter could sit calmly and suddenly jump up abruptly as if something had touched his leg, even if nothing had happened. Dreams became short, fragmentary. There was always movement in them. There was always sound. There was always a moment when the light went out. Many began to fear sleep, because sleep meant loss of control, and control was the only thing that remained. The worst thing was that the work changed the idea of normal. The rat hunter stopped being surprised. The gnawed thing became familiar. The smell became familiar. And when something was really wrong, he might not notice it right away. It cost his life. There were those who tried to leave. He told himself, enough. He promised not to go down again. But the city remembered. He was no longer given another job. He was not trusted. He was shunned. Because a rat hunter is not an entry in a book. It is a reputation that goes ahead. Some returned voluntarily, not because of the money, because of the strange silence that the underworld gave. Everything was clear there. Clear. Dangerous, but honest. It was worse up there. There were people there. Expectation. Shame. And then the rat hunter would come down again. There were those who never returned at all. Their bodies were found weeks later, months later, or never found. They were spoken of quietly, without details, because details were unnecessary. Everyone knew how it could have happened. The old rat hunters recognized each other at first sight, by the way they walked, by the way they looked, by the way they held hands. They didn't ask questions. They didn't tell stories, because stories didn't change anything. Sometimes a rat hunter lived to be old. Rarely, but it happened. He didn't come down anymore. He sat by the door. He set traps. They listened to him, not out of respect, out of caution, because he saw things that others didn't want to imagine. Tools, traps, and animals. Potsyurolov never spoke of tools with pride. They were not an extension of the hand. They were a condition of survival. Without them, the descent turned into a lottery. With them, it was only a risk. And the difference between these two words cost lives. The lantern was the main thing. Not a trap, not a stick. The lantern itself. The light did not dispel the darkness. It allowed one to navigate in it. Most used simple oil lanterns. Gas was too dangerous. Candles were too weak. The wick was trimmed before each descent. The flame had to be even. Not too bright, not too dim. Too bright a light blinded after dark. Too weak created the illusion of movement where there was none. The lantern was held low, not to see further, but to see underfoot. The second was a bag, rough, made of thick fabric, stitched several times. Traps were placed in it. Dead rats were placed in it. Sometimes live ones. The bag always grew heavier faster than expected, and that was a bad sign. Traps were different. Simple ones with metal jaws. Cheap, unreliable. The best ones were heavy, with tight springs. They were protected. They were not left for long. The trap was set with hands, without gloves. Not out of stupidity, by feeling. The rat hunter had to know how it would work, because if the trap worked for him, there was no second chance. There were also homemade traps, from ropes, from boards, from whatever was at hand. They were crude, dangerous, and often worked better than factory ones, because they were created for a specific place. Rats learned quickly, and what worked yesterday, today could kill the rat hunter himself. The stick was another tool. Short, strong, without decorations. Not for fighting, for the end. The rat hunter did not like long scenes. A wounded rat was more dangerous than a living one. The blow had to be precise, without emotion. It was work that left no room for sympathy. Clothing was not protection. it was a compromise. Thick pants, rough boots, a jacket that didn't hurt, but no clothing protected completely. Rats found cracks, always, and so bites were inevitable. The most important tool remained the body. Bend over, freeze, take a step back. This was not taught from books. This came with time. And the one who did not feel his body did not live long. But there were also helpers, without which many did not descend at all. Animals. Not as a symbol, not as a weapon, like eyes that saw before a person. Little was said about dogs, because a dog is attachment, and the attachment in this work hurt. The dogs ran ahead. They heard. They stopped. And if the dog froze, the rat catcher froze too, because the animal felt something that a person had not yet managed to do. Ferrets were different. They were not afraid. They climbed where a person could not. They were launched into holes, into crevices, into nests, and they waited. Sometimes the ferret returned with a rat in its teeth. Sometimes it did not return. That was the price. The rat catcher did not call the animals by names, because names meant loss when the animal did not return. And losses here were not counted. Animals were not tools. But in the dungeon, they were treated that way. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. The rat hunter knew where he could not go, an animal would go. Where he could not see, an animal would feel. And this difference was often the only chance to return. The ferret went first. He was kept in the dark even during the day, not for training, out of habit. Ferrets did not like light. They did not seek it. They moved by instinct. When the ferret was released, the rat hunter took a step back, because the animal worked fast, without a doubt. It disappeared into the crack, and for a moment underground it became even quieter. The waiting was the worst. There was no sound of struggle. There was no squeak, only imagination. The ferret could come out with a rat in its teeth. It could come out wounded, or it could not come out at all. The rat hunter waited a long time, sometimes too long, because a ferret that did not return could mean a nest, and a nest meant that the work would not be finished quickly today. The dogs worked differently. They did not climb into cracks. They warned. Smell, movement, tension. The dog would stop suddenly, raise its head, and look into the darkness as if someone were standing there. At such moments, the rat hunter did not move, because the dog never lied. Dogs died less often than ferrets, but the losses were felt more strongly, because the dog looked into the eyes. Sometimes he refused to go any further, and then the rat trapper had to make a choice: go without him, or turn back. Many did not listen to the animal, and it was these stories that ended badly. Live traps were a special topic. Some rat trappers caught rats not for destruction, but for sale. They were bought for fights, for entertainment, for experiments. This was a separate branch of the craft, darker, more cynical. A live rat had to be taken quickly, without damage, without unnecessary noise. And animals were indispensable here. The ferret chased him away. The dog blocked him. The rat ran, and ended up in a bag. This required precision, calculation, and a cool head, because a wounded rat was more dangerous than any trap. Rats learned quickly. They began to recognize ferrets, distinguish smells, change routes, and then the methods stopped working. Rat catchers had to change with them, because a craft that did not change died. Sometimes an animal saved a life. A dog would stop at an invisible gap, A ferret would not go into a crevice where it was too quiet. These little things seemed insignificant, but they were what survival consisted of. But there were other stories, about ferrets that disappeared with the rats, about dogs that rushed forward and did not turn back, about ratcatchers who climbed after them. These stories were rarely told because they were too painful. The rat hunter quickly learned not to get attached, not to call, not to stroke unnecessarily, not to stare for long. It sounds cruel, but it was a form of protection, because in this work, any attachment became a weakness. And yet, when the animal did not return, the silence became different, heavier, and the rat hunter worked on, because to stop meant to think. When everything worked together, it didn't look like a struggle, but like a sequence. No rush, no unnecessary movements. The night began before dark. Patsirolov knew, if you wait too long, fatigue would win before the rats. That's why he went out when the city was just beginning to go out. The hatch opened with difficulty. The metal creaked, and this sound always seemed too loud. Patsirolov went down first. The lantern went down second. The animals went down last. It was an order that wasn't discussed. The first few minutes passed without action, just observation. Light slid along the walls, over the water, over the floor, which seemed solid, but never was. Patsirolov listened, not with his ears, but with his body. Because the sound always came too late here. The ferret wasn't released right away. First the dog. He walked a few steps forward. He stopped. He turned his head. And if the tension changed, the rat catcher could feel it. Only then would the ferret be released. The animal disappeared into the darkness, and the dungeon seemed to hold its breath. The rat catcher became motionless. The traps were ready. The bag was open. This was the moment when it was dangerous to think. The first squeak meant direction. Not victory, just the beginning. The rats rarely came out one by one. One always meant the others. The traps didn't work right away. Sometimes they didn't work at all. And then you had to act quickly. The stick stroke was short. No swing. No anger. The wounded rat did not deserve to be delayed. That sounds cruel. But cruelty was not the point here. Speed was. There were nights when things went wrong. The traps were silent. The ferret would not return. The dog refused to move on. And then the rat catcher had to decide, go deeper or stop. This decision was never easy, because deeper meant risk, and stop meant turning back, and turning back with nothing. Many made the wrong choice, not because they were stupid, but because they were tired. Fatigue ate away caution. It blurred boundaries. A person took an extra step, stopped in the wrong place, leaned too close, and the dungeon took advantage of that. There were nights when everything worked perfectly. The ferret returned, the dog wasn't nervous, the traps worked, the rat trap worked, like part of a mechanism, without thought, without fear. It was these nights that were the most dangerous, because they created the illusion of control. As the bag grew heavier and the movement weakened, the rat trap began to gather. Not immediately, carefully, because the end of the work was no less dangerous than the beginning. A tired body makes stupid mistakes. The exit always seemed far away. The stairs were longer. The light was foreign. When the hatch closed, the rat hunter would pause for a moment. It was a moment when the body didn't yet know that it had survived. It was quiet above. The city was asleep, or pretended to be asleep. The rat hunter didn't look back, because knowing what was down there was dangerous to the mind. Hands were washed mechanically. Clothes were taken off slowly. Sometimes the animals sat next to each other. Sometimes they didn't. If the animal didn't come back, they didn't talk about it. They just kept quiet about it. Bites, infections, and slow death. A bite rarely looked scary. A small hole, a thin red line, sometimes just a scratch. The rat hunter would look at it and shrug his shoulders. It had been worse. And that was the danger. The rats bit quickly, without warning, without the intention to kill. They didn't need to kill. Their strength lay elsewhere, in what they left behind. After descending, the rat hunter would take off his clothes slowly, not out of caution, out of fatigue. The water was cold. The soap was rough. He washed his hands for a long time, his feet too. The bite might not be noticed right away, especially if it was on his ankle, or his calf, or between the fingers. These places always hurt, and another pain was lost among the others. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Sometimes, even the first day. Patsyurolov went to the next challenge. He ate. He drank. He lived on. And then his body began to speak. At first, a fever. Not strong. Barely noticeable. Like a cold. Like overwork. Patsyurolov wrote it off as a night in the cold. On dampness. On age, and he went on working. Then pain, at the site of the bite, deeper than the wound. The skin tightened. It became hot. It turned red. Sometimes a smell appeared. The same. Rotten. Familiar. Then fear came. Not panic. Not a scream. The fear was quiet, because the rat hunter knew what it meant. Doctors were a luxury. They went to the doctor when they could no longer stand. And sometimes they didn't go at all, because the doctor asked questions. He watched. He wrote down. And the rat hunter didn't want notes. Notes meant the end of the work. And the end of the work meant hunger. There were home methods: vodka, vinegar, fire. They cauterized the wound. They cut it open. They bandaged it with a dirty cloth. It rarely helped, but it gave the feeling that something was being done. Sometimes it really helped, but no one knew why exactly. Infections did not have the names that rat hunters used. They said it more simply. Went up, went into the blood, went inside. And if it reached the third, they waited. The fever came at night. Sleep was interrupted. The body trembled. The rat hunter saw something underground that was not there. The walls moved. The lantern went out. The rats talked. It was a moment when a person no longer knew where he was, up or down. Many did not die immediately. It was a slow death. Days, weeks. The person grew weaker, lost weight, stopped leaving the house, and the city passed by. Because a sick rat hunter was an inconvenient reminder. Some survived, the lucky ones, the ones who weren't bitten deeply, the ones whose bodies were still fighting. They were going back to work, but something was different. The fear didn't go away, it just waited. The rat hunters knew one rule: every bite was a matter of time. Not if, but when. And that knowledge was harder than the pain itself. There were stories that were told in whispers about a man who worked for years and died from a small scratch. About a boy who survived dozens of bites and was broken by one. These stories had no moral. They didn't teach. They just were. The work went on, even when the body didn't want to, because rats didn't wait for you to recover. The rats did not come alone. They always brought something more with them than teeth and claws, something that could not be seen, something that could not be hit with a stick, something that did not respond to traps. Disease. The city did not like this word. They avoided it. They said it differently. Fever. Weakness. It went around the district, but everyone understood what it was about. The rat hunter was the first to encounter it. He climbed where life and death accumulated. He touched bodies, water, air, and went up, carrying on him something that no one had ever felt before. In some neighborhoods, people knew, if a rat hunter starts to get sick, he won't have long to wait. First one, then the other, then the child. People didn't connect it directly. They didn't want to, because to admit it was to admit that danger lived beneath them. The fevers came in waves, suddenly, without explanation. Intense heat, dizziness, a weakness that wouldn't let go. Some recovered, some didn't, and no one knew why. There were diseases that rat hunters could recognize faster than doctors, by smell, by skin color, by the way a person breathed. They didn't know the names, but they knew the consequences. This one won't work. This one is still coming. This one is no longer ours. The rat hunters themselves became isolated. They were avoided. They were feared. The same people who called them at night yesterday, today crossed the street. Because fear always seeks a simple face. During such periods, the city changed. The markets emptied. The schools closed. The churches filled. People prayed not for health, for not being next. The doctors argued. Some talked about the air, others about water, still others about divine punishment. And the rats continued to run underfoot, and the ratcatchers continued to descend. Because the disease did not stop the work, it accelerated it. In such times they paid more. Danger was expensive. And the ratcatcher went, even if the body no longer obeyed. Because when the city panics, there is no choice. There were times when the rat hunter understood. He had become a source. He was bringing something with him, to the house, to the neighborhood. And this thought was more painful than any bite, because there was no protection from this. Some tried to leave, to disappear, to wait it out. But the city did not wait. And those who returned often brought the disease back with them. The rats were convenient culprits. They could be pointed at. They could be hated. But the rat hunters knew it was not just about them. It was about how the city lived and how it hid what it did not want to see. During periods of epidemics, the dungeons became even more dangerous. Weak bodies, bad air, fear that pressed harder than the walls. And yet people came down, because when there was illness above, below seemed more familiar. Those who survived rarely spoke of it as luck. Survival did not feel like a victory. It felt like a reprieve. The body no longer belonged to the person completely. It became a place where something went wrong and never went back to its place. After the fever, there was weakness. Not the kind that goes away after sleep, but the kind that settles deep down. Potsyrolov could lift the bag and suddenly feel that his hands no longer obeyed. His breath became shorter. His heart was uneven, and no one could say whether it would pass. The wounds healed slowly. The scars were rough, dark. Sometimes they hurt even after years. Some bites left behind a constant pain, not a sharp one, a dull one, a reminder. And every time when he returned, the person remembered that night. There were worse consequences. The infection could go up the limb. The hand would swell. The leg would turn black. Then they talked about amputation. Not as a cure, as a last chance. Not everyone agreed, because living without a hand meant never working again, and not working meant being at the bottom again. Some survived, but never went down again. They became different. They sat at the entrances. They set traps. They told people where not to go. They listened to them in silence, because those who listened carefully lived longer. The psyche healed even worse than the body. A person could walk, eat, work, but suddenly she stopped in the middle of the room because she heard a sound that wasn't there. Movement in the corner, a shadow under her feet, and her heart started beating as if she were underground again. Some people couldn't stand the silence. The silence seemed threatening, as if something was about to move. They left the lights on. They talked to themselves. They listened to the street even at night, because the silence resembled a drain. Potsyrolov, who had survived a serious illness, always worked differently, more carefully, slower, but at the same time less patiently, because he knew his body would no longer endure as much as before, and this knowledge pressed him more than fear. There were also those who survived, but they couldn't stand it psychologically. They became harsh, irritable. They drank more. They slept less. Sometimes they themselves sought out the darkness, as if to make sure that all this was really happening. They said of such people, "He was already there," even if he was standing nearby. Rarely, but there were those who left for good after their illness. They changed cities, names, jobs. They tried to live differently, but the darkness often caught up with them, because what a person saw underground did not disappear with the work. The rats knew to survive does not mean to escape. It means to live with the consequences, with a body that betrayed him, with a memory that is not silent, and with the understanding that the next bite may be the last. Working for a penny and bargaining with landlords. The money came at the end, not at the beginning, not as a promise, but as an afterword. Potsyrolov never knew for sure how much he would be paid until he got to the top, and even then it wasn't guaranteed. Landlords didn't like talking about rats. It ruined the reputation of the house. It lowered the rent. It raised unnecessary questions. So the conversation always began cautiously. Something was making noise there. Maybe mice. Probably nothing serious. But Pacyurolov knew, if he was called, it was already serious. The price was determined not by the complexity of the work, but by the fear of the one who paid. If the landlord was afraid of a scandal, he paid more. If he was afraid of the costs, he bargained to the last. Pacyurolov stood silently, with a lantern in his hand, in dirty clothes. He didn't press, because the pressure was unnecessary. The city itself pushed people to make a decision. Sometimes the bargaining took place after work. That was the worst. Pacyurolov would return from the basement, tired, smelly, and they would tell him, "Well, you didn't catch everyone. Something else is still running. Or maybe they'll come back." And the coins would become smaller. They would throw the money into their hands. They didn't count it. They didn't thank them, because gratitude meant admission of dependence, and the homeowners didn't want that. There was an unspoken hierarchy. In richer areas, people paid more, but the descent was worse. Old houses, deeper basements, open drains. In poor areas, they paid less, but there was more work, and the rat hunter chose not between good and evil, but between risk and hunger. Often they paid not in money, in bread, in coal, in old clothes. This was considered normal, because the rat hunter was a shadow worker. His work had no fixed price. The worst thing was working for several owners at once. The houses were connected underground. The rats knew no boundaries, and they paid, each for himself. And the rat hunter found himself between them. One said, "I paid." Another, "This is not my share." And the darkness remained common. Some rat-catchers learned to bargain. They talked about risk, about bites, about infections. But these words did not always work, because for the homeowner, the danger was abstract. He did not go down. He did not see, and therefore he did not pay for fear. There were also those who paid generously, not out of kindness, out of pragmatism. They knew cheap work is the return of the problem, and they paid so as not to see the rat-catcher again. The rat-catcher never worked under a contract. Everything was verbal, undefined, temporary, and it was not beneficial to him, because if something went wrong, it was his fault. There were cases when the rat-catcher was not allowed back into the house, after work, after going down. The doors were closing. They wouldn't give him the money, and he was leaving, because there was no one to prove it. The city authorities knew about it, but they rarely intervened, because the rat-catchers were needed, but they were inconvenient. It was better for them to stay on the edge. The rat-catchers quickly understood one thing. Their work was valued exactly as much as people feared what was lurking beneath their feet. And fear was always changeable. Humiliation did not come suddenly. It did not come in the form of a blow. It was a process. First, a delay. Come later. There is no money now. Let's go tomorrow. The rat hunter nodded, because tomorrow meant hope, and hope was the currency with which he was most often paid. Then doubt. And you really did everything? I was told that there were more rats. The neighbor heard movement this morning. Doubt needed no proof. It worked on its own, and the rat hunter began to justify himself, to explain, to talk more than necessary. That was the first mistake, because the more he talked, the less he was listened to. The landlord looked at him as a problem that had not yet been solved, and the problem didn't deserve full payment. There were other methods. If not you, we'll find someone else. There are many like you here. The work is not difficult. These words sounded ordinary, as if it were some small favor. But the rat hunter knew other meant someone who would agree to less, and that someone was always there. The addiction formed quickly. One call, the second, the third. The homeowner would remember the face. He would get used to it. And suddenly, the rat hunter would become the only option. Not because he was the best, but because he had already been here. Then the demands would appear. Come in again. Look over there. Here's my basement, too. No extra payment, without a new agreement, because since it's here, why not do it? Refusal was dangerous. Not physically, socially. Refusal meant rumors, a bad reputation, no work. And the Patsiurolov lived from call to call. Sometimes he was made to wait, for hours, in the yard, in the corridor. It was intentional. Waiting broke him faster than shouting, because it reminded him of who was making the decisions here. There were also outright deceptions. The payment was divided. Coins disappeared. Amounts changed. Try to prove it. Patsiurolov had no receipts, witnesses, records. He had only dirt and the smell of darkness. Sometimes homeowners used the fear of disease. You were there, right? And what if you brought something? Don't come close. It was convenient to scare someone who was himself afraid. Patsiurolov found himself in a strange trap. He was needed, but unwanted. He was called, and at the same time kept at a distance. This created a tacit agreement. You will do the work, and we will pretend that nothing had happened. The worst thing was working in apartment buildings. There, responsibility dissolved. Each resident paid for his own fear, and no one paid for the common fear. Patsiurolov worked longer. He received less, and he came out guilty. There were attempts to unite, to speak together, to demand a fixed fee. It didn't work, because there was always someone who would settle for less, and the system remained. The city authorities knew about bargaining. They knew about deception, about humiliation. But to intervene meant to admit the problem, and they preferred not to notice the problem. Patsiurolov learned to be silent, not to ask, not to explain, not to expect justice. He took what was given and moved on, because tomorrow there might be a new challenge, and there might not be. When everything worked together, it didn't look like a struggle, but like a sequence. No rush, no unnecessary movements. The night began before dark. Patsiurolov knew, if you wait too long, fatigue would win before the rats. That's why he went out when the city was just beginning to go out. The hatch opened with difficulty. The metal creaked, and this sound always seemed too loud. Patsiurolov went down first. The lantern went down second. The animals went down last. It was an order that wasn't discussed. The first few minutes passed without action, just observation. Light slid along the walls, over the water, over the floor, which seemed solid, but never was. Patsiurolov listened, not with his ears, but with his body. Because the sound always came too late here. The ferret wasn't released right away. First the dog. He walked a few steps forward. He stopped. He turned his head. And if the tension changed, the rat catcher could feel it. Only then would the ferret be released. The animal disappeared into the darkness, and the dungeon seemed to hold its breath. The rat catcher became motionless. The traps were ready. The bag was open. This was the moment when it was dangerous to think. The first squeak meant direction. Not victory, just the beginning. The rats rarely came out one by one. One always meant the others. The traps didn't work right away. Sometimes they didn't work at all. And then you had to act quickly. The stick stroke was short. No swing. No anger. The wounded rat did not deserve to be delayed. That sounds cruel. But cruelty was not the point here. Speed was. There were nights when things went wrong. The traps were silent. The ferret would not return. The dog refused to move on. And then the rat catcher had to decide. Go deeper or stop. This decision was never easy, because deeper meant risk, and stop meant turning back, and turning back with nothing. Many made the wrong choice, not because they were stupid, but because they were tired. Fatigue ate away caution. It blurred boundaries. A person took an extra step, stopped in the wrong place, leaned too close, and the dungeon took advantage of that. There were nights when everything worked perfectly. The ferret returned, the dog wasn't nervous, the traps worked, the rat trap worked, like part of a mechanism, without thought, without fear. It was these nights that were the most dangerous, because they created the illusion of control. As the bag grew heavier and the movement weakened, the rat trap began to gather. Not immediately, carefully, because the end of the work was no less dangerous than the beginning. A tired body makes stupid mistakes. The exit always seemed far away. The stairs were longer, the light was foreign. When the hatch closed, the rat hunter would pause for a moment. It was a moment when the body didn't yet know that it had survived. It was quiet above. The city was asleep, or pretended to be asleep. The rat hunter didn't look back, because knowing what was down there was dangerous to the mind. Hands were washed mechanically. Clothes were taken off slowly. Sometimes the animals sat next to each other. Sometimes they didn't. If the animal didn't come back, they didn't talk about it. They just kept quiet about it. Child helpers and the lowest level of the bottom children were talked about reluctantly. Not because it was a secret, but because everyone knew. In the Victorian city, childhood was short. Sometimes a few years, sometimes a few months, and sometimes it was not there at all. Children appeared in this work not as an exception, but as a logical continuation. Narrow passages, low drains, holes where no adult could crawl. The city did not ask who would crawl there. It simply created a need. Boys were more common, not because girls were pitied, but because boys were considered more hardy. It was a convenient lie. A child was not called a worker. She was a helper, a boy on the hook, to the one holding the lantern. The words made everything less scary. The first task was to stand, by the hatch, by the stairs, in the dark. Hold the light. Don't move. Wait. For the child, this was the hardest, because waiting is the time when fear is born. Next, carrying. Bags, traps, dead bodies. They were heavy, dirty, and they smelled so much that the smell didn't wash off for weeks. The child learned not to frown. Gradually, another task appeared. Climb in there. See what's there. Tell me if it moves. They said this calmly, as if they were asking to pass the thing. The children climbed where adults couldn't. Under the beams, into the cracks, into the narrow branches. Sometimes they came back. Sometimes they didn't. They talked about the missing children in the same way as they talked about the missing adults, without details, because the details made the situation unbearable. There were parents who brought their children themselves, not because of cruelty, because of hunger. A child who works eats, and that was enough to justify everything else. The rat hunters didn't want it. Many really didn't want it. But when the choice was between a stranger's child going and none going, the city chose the former. The children quickly learned to be silent, not to shout, not to ask questions, not to stare for long, because emotions were dangerous here. In the dungeons, children's movements were different, faster, clumsier, and that was a problem, because rats responded to movement, and a child who got scared could wreak havoc. Some of the children became too good at this job. They moved quietly. They could see in the dark. They could sense space. And that scared the adults, because children weren't supposed to look like that. The first bites became a lesson. The second ones became a habit. The third ones became a part of the body. The child didn't always talk about them, because a bite meant weakness, and weakness meant that they wouldn't be hired again. In the evening, such children fell asleep instantly. No stories, no games. Sleep was the only place where they could still be children. They weren't written about in reports. They weren't counted, not mentioned. They were too low to go down in history. There came a time when an adult could no longer crawl through. Not because of fear, because of the body. The shoulders were too broad. The chest was too big. The arms were too stiff. And the walk remained. And then the gaze turned downward. The child stood nearby, not because she had been called, but because she was already here. She was holding a lantern. She was carrying a sack. She knew the smells, and that was enough to say, "You will crawl through." Without shouting, without orders, as if it were obvious. Such walks were the worst. Not drains, but remnants. Old branches, broken channels, cavities between the walls. There was no water there, and that was more frightening, because silence meant that someone had already settled there. The child would lie down on her stomach. She would stretch her arms forward and crawl. The lantern would often be left behind. There wasn't enough light. She would move by touch. The adults would wait. They wouldn't look. They wouldn't rush. Because if something went wrong, it would be unbearable to watch. The child would see first. Eyes in the darkness. Movement in the dust. Bodies merging into one. She didn't always understand what she was seeing, and that was the scariest thing. Rats weren't afraid of children as much as adults. They didn't feel threatened. Sometimes they would come closer. They would sniff. They would touch. And the child had to stay still. If she screamed, the move became a trap. If she ran, the panic spread to everyone. That's why children were taught to be silent before speaking. Sometimes the child would return, dirty, trembling, and say, "There's a lot of them." That meant a long night. Sometimes she wouldn't return, and then the adults would wait some more. A minute, 2, longer, until the wait became harder than the fear. Then someone would follow her. Sometimes they would find a body. Sometimes they would find just a lantern. They didn't talk about it, because speaking meant stopping. Some children worked so regularly that they no longer looked like children. Their movements were careful. Their gaze was absent. They didn't play. They didn't laugh. They waited for the next descent. The city accepted it silently, because children were convenient, small, flexible, cheap, and most importantly, replaceable. There were areas where children's descents became the norm. Adults didn't even try to climb through. They immediately looked at the children. It didn't look cruel. It looked familiar. And that was the horror. The parents knew. Not all of them, but enough. And many turned away, because if they looked, they would have to stop. And stopping meant being left without food. Some tried to limit it, just not far, just to look, just once. These words meant nothing, because underground there is no a little. The children who survived grew up quickly, not in their bodies, with their eyes. They looked at the world as if they knew more about it than they should. Some of them became ratcatchers, early, without choice. They already knew the moves. They knew the fear. They knew the price. And the city accepted them, as they accept something they have long expected. There were children who were not expected back. That sounds harsh, but it's true. Not because they were not loved, but because waiting was dangerous. Because waiting meant questions, and questions meant responsibility. People disappeared in the city every day. Adults, old people, sick people. But the disappearance of a child should have changed something. It wouldn't have. But down below the level of life, these rules didn't apply. Children from poor neighborhoods had no documents, no records, no voice. They existed only as long as they were seen, and underground, no one looked for long. When a child didn't return, at first they waited. Not for long. Then the hatch was closed, the lights were turned off, and the work went on, because the night couldn't wait. They didn't report the disappearance. There was nowhere to go. There was no one to go to. The police would ask, where did she work? Why was she there? And the answer was dangerous. So they kept quiet. Sometimes the parents would look for the child. They would go from house to house. They would ask quietly. They would lower their eyes. They would tell them, maybe she ran away. Maybe she went to look for work. Maybe she'll come back. These words meant nothing, but they closed the conversation. There were children whom no one even looked for. Orphans, runaways, those who slept in basements. No one remembered their names. And that's why their disappearance left no trace. The rat hunters knew. They knew that someone hadn't returned. They knew where it could have happened. But they didn't. Because talking meant admitting complicity. And admitting gave them nothing but another broken life. The city accepted it silently, because silence was part of the system. Silence allowed them to go on living. Sometimes a body was found. Weeks later, months later, sometimes never. Not all bodies come back from the ground. The children who stayed behind learned quickly not to get attached, not to ask, not to remember names, because memory hurt. Some of them didn't even cry, not because they didn't feel, but because tears didn't change anything. This was the lowest level of the bottom, where life had no value even in pennies, where a child was only a possibility. And yet, even in this darkness, there were those who remembered. The occasional rat catcher, the neighbors, the old women on the stairs. They remembered faces, names, movements. Sometimes they remembered in whispers. That was all that remained. Night descents, when the light doesn't reach. Night descents began differently, not out of fear and not out of haste, out of the realization that this time the light was just a convention. The lantern was always with him, but there were places where it didn't matter. They didn't call out during the day for such challenges. They agreed in whispers, after sunset, when the city was quiet. It's deep there. No one had been there for a long time. There's no light there. These words sounded cautious, as if they were afraid to say them out loud. Night descents were longer, not by distance, by the sense of time. The clock stopped. Thoughts fell apart. Pachurolov knew, if you lose your rhythm, you'll lose yourself. The first few meters were no different. The same stairs, the same hatches, the same smell. But then the space changed. The ceilings became lower. The air became thicker. The sounds became duller. And then there came a feeling that was impossible to describe, as if someone had put their hand over the ears of the city. The sound disappeared first. Drops fell, but you didn't hear them. Footsteps were there, but they didn't return with an echo. Even breathing seemed muffled. This was more frightening than the squeak of rats, because sound is evidence of space, and without it, space became suspicious. The lantern in such places didn't shine forward, but inward. The light slid through the fog, through the dust, through the humidity, and it seemed that it did not reach the walls, as if the darkness swallowed it while still in the air. The rat hunters stopped more often, not because they were afraid, but because they were listening, not with their ears, with their skin. Vibrations, changes in pressure, barely noticeable air movements. It was a language that was not taught. In night descents, they rarely worked with animals. The dogs refused to go any further. The ferrets lost their orientation. The animals sensed something that people could not yet name, and when the animal did not go, it was a sign. But signs were not always listened to, because night calls signaled urgency. Something had disappeared there. The previous one had not returned there. It was already too late there. These words left no choice. In such places, rats behaved differently. They didn't run. They didn't hide. They watched. The lantern cut eyes out of the darkness, and those eyes didn't disappear. They stayed. And that meant that you had already gone too far. The rat hunter walked slowly. Every step was like a reality check, because the night descents distorted distance. What seemed close could be far. What seemed far could be nearby. There were places where the lantern went out for no reason. Not abruptly, not dramatically. The flame simply diminished, and the rat hunter froze. Because at that moment, to move meant losing direction. Some people at such moments sat down on the floor. I pressed the lantern to my chest. I waited, not for the light, for a decision. Because sometimes the only right thing to do is to not go any further. But night descents rarely ended quickly, because once you're here, it's harder to turn back than to go forward. This is the paradox of the dungeon. The rat hunters said, "The night does not like those who doubt." And it was true. Doubt made movements sharp, breathing loud, the body noticeable. And underground, being noticeable meant becoming part of the space. In some places, the light simply disappeared. It didn't go out. It didn't dim. It disappeared, as if it had never been there. And then all that remained was what you remember. Steps, turns, feelings. There were stories about rat hunters who emerged from the night descent by others. They didn't tell what they saw. They just said, "You shouldn't be there." And that was enough to keep the others quiet. There were places that were not labyrinths. A labyrinth has logic, even if it is confusing. And these spaces had only memory. Old passages, filled up branches, shifted walls. What was once a passage now became a trap. Patsiorolov went where the maps no longer worked. Even if the map was in his head, even if he was already here. Because underground, time changes geometry. A step forward did not always mean moving away from the exit. Sometimes it was the other way around. You walked and returned to the same place. But it looked different. The ceiling was a little lower. The smell was a little different. There was a little less light. And that was enough for doubt to grow. In such spaces, there were no clear angles. The walls smoothly passed into each other. The floor changed its slope. The body lost the sense of level. And then the mistakes began. The most dangerous thing was stopping. When the rat hunter stopped for a long time, the space seemed to be approaching. It did not move. It did not make any noise. It simply became closer. It was a feeling that could not be explained, as if the walls were waiting. Some began to count the steps. 1, 2, 10. This did not help for long, because underground the steps are not equal. One is longer, the other is shorter, and the count got lost. Others left marks, scratches, chalk, pieces of cloth, but the night descents ate away the marks. The moisture washed away the chalk. The darkness hid the scratches, and the fabric looked alien. There were places where the space changed the sound. The scream did not return immediately, but after a few seconds, and it came from the other side. It broke the sense of direction, because if the sound does not know where you are standing, how can you know? At such moments, a person began to doubt his own memory. Have I been here before? Is this another place? And doubt became more dangerous than the darkness. There were rat hunters who said that the space underground remembers fear, not as a living being, but as a fingerprint. The more people got lost, the easier it was to get lost again. It sounded like a delusion, but many nodded. Sometimes the space would physically close, a collapse, a landslide, a displacement of beams. What had been a passage an hour ago ceased to be one, and then there was no choice. In such situations, the rat hunter did not run. Running meant rapid exhaustion. He sat down. He listened. Not to sounds, to the body. Because the body felt where there was still air. Some knocked, on pipes, on walls. The signals were simple. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. Sometimes they answered. Sometimes they didn't. There were times when the rat hunter heard footsteps, not his own. They walked parallel, slowly, no hurry. When he stopped, they did too. That was the worst. Because if it wasn't a man, and not an animal, what was it? Some at such moments speak out loud, not to call out, but to make sure that something else existed. A voice in the darkness was like an anchor. Time in a confined space was falling apart. Minutes dragged on like hours, and hours could disappear. And when the rat hunter came out, he didn't always know how long he had been away. There were those who didn't come out. They weren't always found. And when they were found, they often didn't immediately understand what had happened. The body was intact. No bites. No wounds. Just not where it should have been. Such descents were spoken of quietly, because they were more frightening than any story about rats. Because rats could be understood, but space was not. There were descents after which people could not say where exactly they got lost. Not a turn, not a move, not a moment, just somewhere. The night had no edges. It had no beginning and no end. It was a state. The first thing that disappeared was certainty. Not fear, not panic, but the certainty that there was a way out. A person still remembered the stairs, the hatch, the air above, but it no longer seemed real. The light began to deceive. The lantern illuminated the wall, and it seemed that this was a dead end. A step to the side, and the wall seemed to recede. The shadows moved slower than the body, and this created the feeling that you were falling behind yourself. At such moments, the rat hunter stopped looking for rats. They no longer mattered. Only the direction remained, but the direction no longer held. Some tried to return the same way. This rarely worked, because night descents changed distances. What was short became long. What was straight became crooked. When the lantern began to dim, silence came. Not the absence of sounds, but the absence of expectation. A person stopped waiting for an answer from space, and space answered. There were rat hunters who, in such situations, would lie down on the floor. Not out of weakness, out of understanding. Because standing meant wasting strength, and lying down meant accepting. Time at that moment completely fell apart. Seconds dragged on. Minutes disappeared. A person could think that an hour had passed, or it could have been several minutes, or vice versa. Some began to see light that wasn't there. Above, ahead, from the side. It looked warm, steady, and that was dangerous, because light without a source always led to the wrong place. There were cases when a rat hunter followed such a light, and he was found later, without wounds, without bites, in a place where no one should be. Others heard voices, not clear, not familiar, as if someone was speaking through water. And these voices were not calling, they accepted. The Pazzirolovs used to say, "If the night starts talking to you, you're already too late." Those who survived such descents came out differently, not always right away, but something in them changed forever. They didn't like enclosed spaces. They didn't trust silence. They avoided dark corridors, even during the day. Some never went down again, even for a lot of money, even under pressure. They said, "I've already been where the light doesn't reach," and that was enough. There were also those who returned again, not because they wanted to, but because the night stayed with them, and he couldn't live until he returned to where it began. Those who disappeared in night descents were rarely spoken of as dead. They said, "He didn't come out. They didn't find him. He stayed there." The word "there" replaced everything. The city didn't change because of it. No one closed the hatches forever. No one stopped the work. Because the night descents were part of the mechanism. Dark, invisible. Death under the footprints of the city. The death of a rat hunter rarely seemed like an event. It didn't gather people. It didn't stop traffic. It didn't ring bells. It just happened. And the city continued to live as if nothing had changed. Most deaths were called accidental, slipped, choked, stayed too long. These words were convenient. They didn't demand answers. They didn't demand those responsible. Collapses happened often. Old beams, washed out masonry, moisture that had worn away the stone over the years. A rat hunter could work in the same place dozens of times, and then the floor would simply disappear, without warning, without a sound. The body wasn't always found. Sometimes after a few days, sometimes by chance, sometimes never. There were many places underground where a person could disappear without a trace. If a body was found, it was raised silently. No formalities, no records. The minimum was recorded. Sometimes just a name, sometimes not even a name. Death by suffocation was one of the most common. The air in the dungeons could disappear suddenly. Gas, rot, closed space. A person would lose strength before he realized that something was wrong. Such deaths seemed calm. No struggle, no scream. The body simply remained where it fell, and the city did not hear it. There were other deaths. Falls into mines, falls into old wells, getting stuck in narrow passages. These were deaths without witnesses, and that is why, without stories. Ratcatchers knew these risks, but knowledge did not protect, because risk was not an exception. It was part of the craft. Sometimes death came slowly, because of infection, because of complications, because of weakness that was not treated. Such deaths occurred upstairs, in rooms, in beds, and they looked like an ordinary illness. People did not associate them with work, because it was inconvenient. It was more convenient to think that the person simply got sick. Rarely did anyone ask, "Where did he work?" And what did he do before? Because the answer led downwards. Ratcatchers' deaths were not counted. They did not make lists. They did not keep statistics. They were not a separate category. They simply disappeared from the city. Others came to take their place, quickly, without ceremony, because work did not wait. Sometimes the death became known only when someone did not come to the call. Then they searched, not out of pity, out of practicality, because they needed to know whether the path was clear. There were rat hunters who disappeared during night descents. They said about them, "He did not come out." That was all the information. Homeowners did not like when someone died in their homes. Not out of sympathy, because of problems. The body is the issue, and the issue is the danger. Therefore, deaths were tried to resolve quietly. Take out, put away, close, and get back to business. The city authorities knew, but intervention meant recognizing the scale, and the scale was more frightening than individual deaths. The ratcatcher's death did not change the routes. The hatches did not close. The passages did not fill up. Because the problem was not in the passage, but in the person who went there. That's what they thought at the top.
There were people who disappeared, as if they never existed.
Not in the sense of memory, but in the sense of documents. They were not written about. They were not counted. They were not officially searched for. They simply stopped appearing. Podsurolov did not come to the call. He did not answer. He did not appear anywhere else. At first, it was attributed to drunkenness, to running away, to changing the district. These explanations were convenient, because disappearing without explanation required action. A few days would pass, then a week, and the name would begin to fade. It was easy to disappear in the city, especially for someone who did not have a permanent address, a permanent job, permanent papers. And rat hunters rarely had anything permanent. There were disappearances that were not even noticed, because the person lived alone, or among the same people. No one was waiting for her in the evening. No one asked in the morning. And the city did not feel the loss. There were many places underground where the body could remain forever. Niches, covered passages, branches that no one else opened. The body could end up there and become part of the space. Sometimes it was found years later, during repairs, pipe rerouting, basement expansion. And then the question arose, who is it? To which no one had an answer. The bones were put in a bag. They passed them on. And the story ended. Because without a name, there was no history. The rat hunters knew about such places, about the passages where someone had disappeared. They tried to avoid them. But the night descents often led exactly there, because problems accumulated there where no one wanted to climb. Disappearing without a body was more convenient than death, because death demanded explanations. Disappearance? No. Maybe he left. Maybe he moved. Maybe he'll show up again. These words closed the topic. For the families, it was the worst, because there was no end. There was no funeral. There was no grave.
There was no moment when you could say, "That's it."
There was only waiting. Some waited for years, listened to every knock, to every step on the stairs, and then stopped waiting. Not because they had resigned themselves, and because there was no strength. The city did not like those who asked too much. Questions broke the silence, and silence was more important than the truth. There were rumors about entire sections of the dungeon where people were lying, not next to each other, not together, but simply abandoned. It sounded like an exaggeration, like a horror story, but those who worked long hours did not laugh. Sometimes disappearance was beneficial. For the landlord, because there was no scandal. For the city, because there was no business. Even for colleagues, because the work became available. It sounds cruel, but that was how the system worked. The missing ratcatchers did not make it into the chronicles. They were not written about in the newspapers. They were not mentioned in reports, because they were too low. Sometimes the names still rang out, in the tavern, on the stairs, in whispered conversations. Remember the man who worked there? He hadn't been seen for a long time. That was all that remained. Over time, even these memories faded, because the city moved on, and the places where people once worked became just places.
Місто не зупинялося, навіть коли під ним залишалися люди. Особливо, коли залишалися люди. Бо зупинка означала дивитися вниз, а дивитися вниз було небезпечно. Коли зникала людина, простір не зникав. Навпаки, він швидко отримував нову функцію. Прохід засипали, хід перекривали, нішу замуровували. Не з поваги, з практичності. Бо порожній простір завжди здавався загрозою. Будинки перебудовувалися, підвали розширювали, фундаменти укріплювали, труби прокладали поверх старих ходів, і те, що колись було шляхом, ставало основою. Іноді під час робіт робітники знаходили кістки. Це не викликало паніки, не було криків, не було зупинки. Хтось казав «старе», і цього було достатньо, щоб рухатися далі. Кістки переносили. А іноді ні. Якщо вони не заважали, їх залишали, бо час коштував дорожче. Так смерть вбудовувалася в місто, не як пам'ять, як матеріал. Пацюролови знали про такі місця, про підвали, де під ногами щось є. Вони не питали, що, бо знання не змінювало маршруту. Місто навчилося жити над втратою. Це була форма виживання. Бо якщо пам'ятати кожного, місто зупинилося б. У деяких будинках люди відчували дивне, холодні плями, запахи без джерела, звуки вночі. Вони пояснювали це трубами, вологістю, старістю будинку. І це працювало. Рідко хтось думав, що під підлогою може бути людина, бо це було надто важко прийняти. Газети писали про нове будівництво, про розширення кварталів, про розвиток. Вони не писали про те, що залишалося знизу. Іноді знаходили старі інструменти – ліхтар, палицю, пастку. Вони лежали там, де їх залишили, як доказ того, що хтось працював і не вийшов. Але навіть ці знахідки рідко пов'язували з людьми. Час стирав межу між тілом і ґрунтом. Те, що колись було людиною, ставало частиною шару, і місто стояло на цьому шарі без коливань. Діти гралися зверху, люди спали, торгували, одружувалися. Життя тривало. Бо інакше воно не могло тривати. Пацюролови, які працювали довго, починали це розуміти. Вони знали, якщо зникнуть, місто не помітить. І це знання змінювало все. Дехто залишав роботу, дехто йшов глибше. Бо коли ти знаєш, що твоя смерть стане фундаментом, страх змінює форму.
Those who survived and remembered. Those who survived rarely called themselves lucky. They said otherwise. I was lucky not to get lost. I got out in time. I knew when to stop. These words were not bragging. They were an excuse. The old ratcatchers no longer went down, not because they couldn't, but because they knew. They knew where skill ended and chance began. You could recognize them from afar, not by their clothes, not by their tools, by the way they looked at the hatches. Not with curiosity, not with fear, but with something resembling fatigue. They sat at the entrances to the cellars, on the stairs, in the corners of the yards. mending traps, cleaning lanterns. They did small jobs, and they watched. The younger ones came to them not for knowledge, for permission. Can I go there? Is it safe there? Have you been there? The old ones did not answer right away, because a hasty answer could kill. They remembered moves that no longer existed, turns covered by years, places where the light always went out. These maps existed only in the head. The old ratcatcher's memory was not chronology, it was a feeling. Here it was colder. Here it was death. Here they did not return. He could not always explain why, but that was not necessary. They did not tell stories for entertainment. Every mention had a purpose: to warn, stop, save. Sometimes they said names, quietly, without details. Here Thomas disappeared, and here was a boy, I don't remember his name, and that was enough to make the place dangerous in memory. The old rat-catchers didn't like being written down. They didn't trust paper, because the paper remained, and they didn't. Some of them stopped talking altogether. They sat. They listened, as if they were waiting for someone else to say it for them. There were some who talked too much. They repeated the same thing over and over. They confused places. They confused time. It was a different kind of memory, the one that broke. The young listened carefully, not out of respect, out of understanding, because the old men spoke about things that could not be verified. Sometimes the old rat-catcher would raise his head and say, "Don't go there today," without explanation, without argument, and those who listened often lived longer. The rat hunters had no chronicles, no shift logs, no reports, no maps with the dead marked, because all of this required recognition, and recognition was dangerous. Instead, there was oral memory, fragile, inaccurate, alive. It was transmitted not in words, but in pauses. The memory was heard in the way the old man fell silent before a certain hatch, in the way he tightened his belt more slowly, in the way he looked not at the person, but at the floor. These were not legends. Legends embellish, and there were no embellishments here. There were warnings. Don't go there when it's raining. Don't go in if the water is standing. If the air is warmer, come back. These phrases were not explained, because explanations took too much time, and time underground was expensive. Oral memory was not stable. It changed with each retelling, and that was normal, because dungeons changed too. The young listened not to remember everything, but to learn to hear when the old man's voice became quieter, when the words stopped, when he said, "I don't remember anymore." That was also knowledge. Some stories were passed down for decades, not by names, by places. That corner, those stairs, that pit. And each generation added something of its own. There were stories that never ended. He went there, and then silence. That meant that no one came back to tell. Oral memory was not accurate. It confused years. It mixed up faces. But it was honest, because it wasn't trying to seem important. Some of the warnings sounded strange. If the lantern starts to smoke, sit down. Don't whistle underground. Don't look back right away. It sounded like superstition, but those who ignored it rarely worked for long. Oral memory lived in gestures, in the way an old man would stop a young man's hand, in the way he changed his route without explanation. It lived in the silence after death. Nobody said, "He died here." They said, "They don't work here anymore." And that was enough. There were attempts to write it down. Someone started a notebook. Someone drew diagrams. It didn't catch on, because the notes got into the wrong people, and knowledge in such hands became dangerous. That's why memory remained in voices, and the voices disappeared. When the old rat hunter died, a part of the map disappeared with him, and the city became a little more dangerous. The young people understood this. That's why they listened more carefully than they spoke, because what was said can be forgotten, and what was heard was felt with the body. Memory doesn't disappear suddenly. It doesn't go out like a lantern. It subsides. First, people stop remembering details, then names, then places, and in the end, all that remains is the feeling that it was once dangerous here, without an explanation as to why. The old rat hunters left one after another, not necessarily from work, from age, from illness, from fatigue. And with each such departure, the city lost another invisible map. No one was going to pass on knowledge officially. There was no final word. There was no ceremony. The knowledge simply didn't have time to be said. The younger ones didn't notice it right away. At first, everything worked. The hatches opened. The descents took place. The work continued. But small things began to go wrong. Where they had stopped before, now they moved on. Where they had waited, they hurried. Where they had been silent, they spoke too much. It looked like progress, but it was a loss. Unspoken boundaries were disappearing. No one said anymore, "They don't work here," because no one remembered why they didn't work. New rat hunters appeared who didn't know the stories. They were bolder, more determined, and less resilient. Deaths began to repeat in the same places, as if the city was paying off its debts. But no one connected these events, because the connection required memory. There were moments when someone suddenly remembered an old phrase, the old gesture, and stopped. These people often survived, but they no longer knew why exactly they stopped. Memory became an instinct, not a story, not a warning, a reflex. And this was the last stage before disappearance. When those who remembered the beginnings died, the city was left without voices from below. What remained from above were documents, plans, schemes, but they did not speak of fear. The dungeons became white spots again, unknown, and each generation discovered them anew, paying the same price. Some old houses still have a reputation. Something is wrong there. The work is not being done there. There are always problems there. This is a shadow of memory, the last thing that remained. The modern rat hunters no longer knew the old names, but sometimes, descending, they felt something familiar. Cold, pressure, an unnatural silence. And this was the only thing that connected them with those who had worked here before. The city today. What remains under our feet? Today the city looks different. The light is brighter, the streets are smoother, the noise is constant. And yet, if you stop, under this noise you can hear something familiar. Not a sound, a presence. Modern man rarely thinks about what is under the pavement. Cables, pipes, the subway. This seems like a complete list, but beneath them is another level: old drains, covered passages, spaces without function, places that no one else serves anymore. Sometimes they make themselves felt: a collapse of the asphalt, a sudden smell, dampness emerging in the basement, and the city is surprised, as if this were the first time. During the reconstruction, workers come across old structures again and again: brick arches, handmade masonry, unexplained holes. They don't always know what they were for, because the function is lost, and so is the memory. Sometimes they find things: an old lantern, an iron trap, a rough stick. They lie where they were left, not like museum exhibits, but like errors of time. Such finds rarely make the news because they don't fit into the image of a modern city. The city prefers to look new, but beneath the new there is always the old, and it is not silent. In some areas, people still complain about rats, despite the poison, despite the technology, despite the services, because the system has become more complex, but the principle has remained. What lives below adapts faster. Modern specialists rarely descend as deep as their predecessors. Most problems are solved remotely, through hatches, through technology. And that is right, but this also means that some places remain unknown. There are dungeons that are not included in any plans. They are not needed, not dangerous enough to close them, and not useful enough to restore them. They simply are. It is in such places that remains are sometimes found. Not always human, but sometimes, yes. And then the question arises: who was it? To which modernity has no answer. The city archives are silent, because much was never written down, and what was lost between reforms, perestroika, wars. And yet, in modern cities, there are people who remember, not personally, but professionally. Engineers, archaeologists, communal workers. They know where not to dig without checking. This is a new form of oral memory, not romantic, not heroic, practical. Sometimes someone says, there is an old passage, better to bypass it, without explanations, without stories. But behind these words is the experience of several generations. The city today is less cruel, but no less complex. It still stands on layers of decisions made long ago, and not all of them were good. There are places where the past does not lie in layers. It is present, not as a memory, as a state. Such places are rarely marked on maps. They have no names, no signs, no stories for tourists. Those who work there know about them, and those who have been there by chance and have not wanted to return. Modern basements are a compromise between the past and the present. New pipes run through old walls. Cables touch bricks that were laid by hand. In between them, there remains space, unused, unexplained. In such places, the air is different. Not colder, not warmer, thicker. It's as if it remembers how many times they've held their breath here. Utility workers know these zones. They don't talk about them much. They simply say, "It's old there. Don't touch it there. It's better to go around it." This is not a superstition. This is experience. Sometimes during repairs, a passage opens that doesn't appear in any plan. It doesn't lead anywhere useful. It doesn't connect systems. It has no purpose. It just is. Such passages are usually closed quickly, not out of fear, out of responsibility. Because if you leave it, you'll have to explain. There are prohibited zones where you're not allowed to go, not because it's dangerous there now, but because you don't know what's next. Modernity doesn't like the unknown. Sometimes you get there by accident. The worker who took the wrong route, the researcher who opened the wrong door. They rarely describe what they saw in detail. They say, "Nothing special, just strange." Strangeness has no form. It manifests itself in the little things, the sound of footsteps that don't return, a shadow that doesn't match the light, the feeling that the space is a bit tighter than it should be. In such places, the desire to speak often disappears. People switch to gestures, nods, short phrases, as if speech is superfluous here. Sometimes they find traces of old work, scratches on the walls, remains of ropes, traces of soot. They don't look like archaeology. They look like an interrupted task. Modern services try to be careful, but they don't always know what exactly to beware of, because there is no documentation, and memory is fragmentary. There are places where modern sensors behave strangely. They show fluctuations. They lose signal. They fail. They blame it on old materials, on humidity, on metal. And it is often true, but not always. People who work underground for a long time say, there are places where it is better not to linger, without explanations. This is a formula that is repeated from generation to generation. The modern city learns to live with this. It does not try to explain everything. It does not try to open everything. Because sometimes a closed space is safer than an open one. This part is about heritage without signs, about places that did not become museums and did not become legends, and they just remained. Modern man rarely thinks about the route. He walks because it is so convenient, because the sidewalk is smoother here, because the light is better here, because it is faster here, and almost never because that is how they walked before. But the city remembers movement, not faces, not names, directions. Streets do not appear by chance. They repeat the lines of old roads, take the form of convenient passages. They bypass what was inconvenient, and often what was dangerous. Many modern roads run where service corridors once ran. The same lines, the same curves. The only difference is that now they are above. We walk over former drains, over filled-up passages, over places where people worked in the dark, and we don't feel it, because movement has become habitual. There are streets that were never built up densely. Something always got in the way there. Subsidence, moisture, instability. And modernity has bypassed these places, without knowing why. Urban planners can explain this by soils, and that would be correct. But these soils were formed over years because of what was underneath them. Some roots repeat for centuries. People change. cities grow, but the direction remains. A modern resident goes to work not knowing that rat hunters once walked beneath his feet, with lanterns, with bags, without a guarantee of return. And you don't need to know this for the path to work. The city preserves its memory not in monuments, but in movement, in where people stop, where they speed up, where they detour. Sometimes modern routes are changed without explanation. Here they block. Here they postpone a stop. Here they make a detour. And no one asks questions, because the changes seem technical. But technical solutions often repeat old instincts. Don't go there. Don't linger here. Detour. Modern maps don't show depth. They are flat, convenient, accurate, but they don't tell about what came before them. And yet, sometimes it is felt. Restlessness in a certain place, the desire to speed up, the unwillingness to stop, for no reason. This is not mysticism. This is an inherited movement, a habit that is not conveyed in words. The city today looks confident, but it stands on layers of caution, on decisions made long ago, on experiences that have not been recorded. And when we follow a familiar route, we do not start from scratch. We continue. Silence under the city. What we brought out of the darkness. The end of this story doesn't feel like an end. There is no final step, no closed door, no light that finally goes out. There is only silence. Silence is what has always been beneath the city. It wasn't empty. It was filled with breaths, with footsteps, with anticipation. And now, when we went up, it didn't disappear. It simply ceased to be ours. We talked about people we didn't remember, about work we didn't want to see, about death that didn't become an event. And all of this was no exception. It was the foundation. A city doesn't come from nothing. It grows from decisions, from compromises, from silent agreements. And among them is a pact with darkness. The raccoon hunters left no monuments. Their names are not engraved. Their faces are not preserved. But they left a space in which you can live. When the city wakes up in the morning, it does not think. And it does not have to. Because gratitude is a form of memory. And memory is too heavy for everyday life. We often think that history is events, wars, coronations, reforms. But beneath them, there is another layer, slow, everyday, invisible. Those who left no choice worked there. The darkness into which they descended was not a symbol. It was a condition, and they accepted it without romance. We can't say that they were heroes, because heroes are remembered, and they aren't. But we can say that without them, the city would look different. Not worse, not better, just different. The silence beneath the city requires no explanation. It doesn't ask for sympathy. It just is. And perhaps that is the main thing that should be taken out of the darkness. Not fear, not horror, not admiration, but caution. Caution in how we relate to places, to work, to people whom we can't see. When we walk through a city, we don't have to think about every layer under our feet. But sometimes it's useful to stop, not to remember, and to realize. Because the city is not only what is in front of your eyes, it is also what we have decided not to see. And when the story ends, it doesn't disappear, it just stops speaking. Silence returns to its place, under the stone, under the asphalt, under our footsteps. And if you listened carefully, you already know. It is there. It has always been, and it doesn't need more words. It was a story about a job that no one wanted, about people who didn't ask to be remembered, about a city that stands on silence. If this quiet journey was important to you, stay. Subscribe to the channel. Write in the comments where you listen to these stories, at home, on the road, before going to bed. And may the silence of history stay by our side for a little longer.